Newsday continues here on One News Now. I'm Jess De Los Santos. Despite diplomatic protests, China continues to spread out its vessels to other parts of the disputed West Philippine Sea. But Malacanang maintains this can only be resolved through diplomacy and not through violence. Patricia Mangune with the story.
Back in March 7, 220 Chinese ships were spotted at the Julian Felipe or Whitsun Reef in the West Philippine Sea. But in the Armed Forces' latest aerial patrol last March 30, only 44 remained. So where are the other vessels believed to be manned by the Chinese maritime militia? 92 simply transferred to the Chihua or Johnson South Reef. 84 are now in the Burgos or Gavin Reef, still near the country's exclusive economic zone. Maritime law expert Attorney J. Batong Bakal said the AFP should remain alert for any possible return, especially when the reefs are unguarded.
The fact that they're still there means that at any time they can be mobilized to again come together, to again concentrate around the specific feature.
Batong Bakal warned that should the Chinese vessels begin firing, the Philippines will be forced to seek aid from the U.S. under the Mutual Defense Treaty. He, however, noted that this does not mean war.
They will be risking, I think, the Mutual Defense Treaty being triggered. And China is very, very careful with that because that would be the perfect opportunity for the U.S. to become involved, and they don't want that.
In a statement, Defense Secretary Delfin Lorenzana said that it is appalling for the Chinese embassy to blatantly disregard international law under the UNCLOS, to which China is a part of. He added their presence is proof of intent to further occupy features in the West Philippine Sea. Chief Presidential Legal Counsel Salvador Panelo finds the intrusion unacceptable. He said this could tarnish the bond between the two countries, destroying peace in the region. The Malacanang stood by Lorenzana's statements but highlighted that only diplomacy is the key to solving the dispute.
Ireresolba po natin ang hidwaang ito sa pamamagitan po ng mapayapang mga pamamaraan sang-ayon po sa UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Ang posisyon po ng Presidente, paninindigan natin ang karapatan pero hindi po ito isang bagay para tayo po ay gumamit ng dahas.
The Chinese embassy in Manila reiterated that the Whitsun Reef is part of China's territory in the Nansha Islands. They warned against unwarranted claims that may worsen tensions. The Foreign Affairs Department disputed the embassy, calling these as blatant falsehoods that sought to promote China's expansive and illegitimate claims. For News 5, Patricia Mangune, we are One News.
March inflation cooled for the first time in 6 months, with CPI coming in at 4.5%. That is less than the 4.9% average inflation economists expected for the month and well within the 4.2 to 5% forecast by the BSP. BSP Governor Ben Jokno attributed the slowdown in inflation to slower gains in food and drink prices. With this latest inflation reading, Jokno said prevailing monetary settings is still appropriate to keep rising prices manageable. Moody's Analytics says the situation in the Philippines is concerning, with the prices of goods and the number of new COVID-19 infections both rising. Let's watch this.
The global economy is really getting back on its feet, and that is good news for economies across the globe, because we will see stronger demand, we will see investment spending start to pick up again, and that will be good news for all economies. And the divergence of performance we are particularly seeing in Asia Pacific. I mean, we've got economies like Philippines where vaccine rollout is troublesome, inflation is high, output gaps are large, whereas in other economies like Australia, for example, they are really getting back on their feet much quicker. If we go back to the Philippines again, we can see that because vaccine rollout is really taking its time, and then they've had a recent resurgence of local cases, we can see that if we're looking at the region, a place like Philippines would be really concerning, and that would be an economy that would keep us up at night. Whereas, other economies, Thailand, Malaysia, they're in a better position, even though they are geographically so close to the Philippines. And so what it really does come down to is how well the the COVID infection and how well these economies can move past that peak, and that's the key ingredient that's going to hold them in good stead throughout this next year of where conditions are supposed to be much better than last year. What the Philippines is going to do, we think, is that they're going to really look through the elevated inflation that they're experiencing at the moment, just because their large output gap and economic management at home, trying to bolster domestic demand, is seen as a greater priority than trying to bring down inflation. Because unless they can really get their COVID management under control and curb local infections and bolster domestic demand as a consequence, then inflation is of course going to falter again. So it's a battle really it's a difficult game to play, is trying to manage both elevated inflation in the Philippines and the COVID rate. But we think that managing the local infections is the bigger priority than trying to cool inflation.
The World Health Organization warns that the slow rollout of COVID-19 vaccines is prolonging the global pandemic. This comes as the European region finds itself fighting yet another resurgence of COVID-19 transmissions. WHO's Office for Europe is now calling on governments in the region to scale up both vaccine production and inoculation. Data shows that so far, only 10% of Europe's total population has received one vaccine dose, and only 4% has completed the full vaccine series. Regional Director Hans-Henry Klug described the rollout in the region as unacceptably slow, especially as Europe posted 1.6 million new cases and 24,000 deaths just last week. WHO Europe is also urging governments in the region to share excess doses of approved vaccines with the COVAX facility, which has allocated 44 million doses for the Philippines this year. Now, we've heard famous vaccine brands like Pfizer and Moderna being called mRNA vaccines by health officials. Some experts say this type of vaccine is relatively new and is fairly different from traditional jabs. But how exactly do messenger RNA vaccines work, and are they safe for use? Bloomberg senior health reporter Robert Langreth gives us the answers and debunks this information in this report.
Messenger RNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna have been shown to be highly effective in preventing COVID-19. But this technology is very new, and that's made them extremely vulnerable to disinformation campaigns. These include a false worry or a false belief that the mRNA vaccines could somehow alter your DNA. So, are mRNA vaccines actually risky? These are the facts that you need to know. So what are mRNA vaccines, and how do they differ from traditional vaccines? Instead of introducing into the body a weakened version of a virus or a piece of a virus, they temporarily turn the body's cells into tiny vaccine-making factories. So how do they do this? Well, what they use is synthesized versions of something called messenger RNA. Now, that's a molecule that normally carries genetic coding from our DNA in the nucleus to the body's protein-making machinery. But what happens here with the vaccines, mRNA, once introduced in the body, instructs the body to make the spike protein, which is a key protein that the SARS-CoV-2 virus uses to enter cells. And now this, in turn, stimulates the body to make long-lasting antibodies to the coronavirus. Messenger RNA vaccines are quicker to develop than traditional ones because production doesn't require growing live viruses or viral proteins inside live cells. Also, messenger RNA's modular nature makes designing vaccines relatively straightforward. In the case of Moderna's vaccine, it took only a few days for researchers to come up with the messenger RNA sequence that is used in the actual vaccine. So what type of disinformation is actually being spread about mRNA vaccines? Well, one thing that that's out there a lot is that steps were somehow skipped in developing or authorizing the vaccines. Now, it's true that these vaccines reached the market in absolutely record time. But that's actually not because any testing steps were skipped. Basically, companies were able to speed up the process by performing some testing steps in parallel. And in addition, especially in the case of Moderna's vaccine, the U.S. government took big financial risks by paying to gear up manufacturing well before the results were in. And in fact, even with the emergency use authorization of these vaccines, the FDA actually established strict guidelines in advance for what they'd be required to get emergency approval. And the vaccines went through full phase 3 trials with 30,000 patients, at least that many or more. And they were required to show more than 50% efficacy in preventing symptomatic disease. And the 2 messenger RNA vaccines easily outperformed that standard. And they were also required to show, 2 months of safety follow-up from their phase 3 trials.
Still no egg rolls for the White House this year as Americans spend their second Easter holiday under the pandemic. But U.S. President Joe Biden did appear alongside a mask-wearing Easter bunny to mark the celebration from the White House balcony. In his address, Biden delivered a message of hope amid the crisis, saying joy is almost here. As of last week, some 4 million people in the U.S. have already received their COVID-19 vaccine. Biden is hoping the traditional Easter egg roll would resume next year.
The virus is not gone, and the second year in a row, most will be apart from their families, their friends, and the full congregation that fill us with so much joy. But the scripture tells us, joy cometh in the morning. As we celebrate the renewal of this season, we know that longed-for dawn is almost here.
And those are the top stories of the hour. Join us later at 12 noon as we continue to monitor the day's biggest stories. You can also catch One News on Signal Play. Register for a free account now at www.signalplay.com and stream One News live anytime, anywhere. I'm Jess De Los Santos. Mask on, wash hands, and stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.